don't run from these rapidly changing technologies that could rapidly change your world for the better, but at the same time, be incredibly vigilant about those technologies scraping off your human capacity in ways you don't want to happen. And so now I've made a very conscious choice. I'm going to do the hard mental work myself by generating those questions initially myself, then engage with the technology in order to collaboratively build something I couldn't before.
Hal, welcome to the barn.
Well, great to be with you. It's always, for whatever reason, I'm always humored when I hear my bio. It feels like an obituary, but that's not a bad thing.
Well, I know you're very far from that. I've seen you in the performance as well. That brings it to life. But anyway, I've got lots of great questions here today. And first of all, I just want to ground things. The biggest picture challenge we all face at the moment is that the world feels like we're in such a complex, disrupted state. Some call it the age of polycrisis or a permacrisis. From your incredible wisdom and the depth that you're spending your hours thinking and working and challenging, what advice can you give leaders to rethink as they make critical decisions today? And can you share some of your best practices, strategies that will help them address these super time sensitive needs?
Well, it's a great question. And I think it's really crucial to think of a simple example and then come back to responding to the actual practicalities of what do I do, if you don't mind.
Yeah, great.
So for me, the example is roughly 10 years ago, when Jensen Huang at NVIDIA saw that people were using GPU processors to make computers to then use algorithms that were decades old in ways they've never done before. This was a decade ago. He then stepped back and rethought what the future of NVIDIA might look like. And he could easily imagine in his mind's eye, like others, Dr. Lisa Su at AMD were also doing the same thing. It's the notion of, he could see in his mind's eye, in roughly 5 to 15 years, this world is going to be revolutionized across every industry. And when he tried to shift his company to that long-term intent, short-term investors were irate, as were gamers, who why are you shifting your attention away from us? But Jensen, like so many leaders who are navigating this uncertainty today, had, number one, a long-term intent. So that's my first answer to you. It's like, if all we focus on is the short term, and in a world of uncertainty, the short term becomes even shorter term. If that's all we do, we're dead. And so it's this notion of, I have a conviction about something long term that I'm not going to be swayed on. And I will make short-term moves in order to get there. We've all heard that notion of short-term, long-term, and usually managers roll their eyes when they hear that. Heard that one before, but my world is just short-term. And all I can say is that in this age we're living in, that's the starting point. It's like, what's the grand challenge in the spirit of MIT leadership, where we call it challenge-driven leadership? What's the grand challenge that has a much longer time horizon than we normally have? And if we don't think and operate that way, we will be stuck in a really problematic world. The second part is, Jensen and Lisa Su, they all had this sense a decade ago that not only is there a long-term intent that we're operating on, but they grasp exponential technologies, rapidly changing technologies. They could imagine in their mind's eye something changing a millionfold. And most leaders today, including myself, can't imagine current large language models being 1 million times better within 5 to 10 years. What does that actually look like? And yet they're capable of understanding those kinds of high volume, rapidly changing technology impacts. And they don't have those technologies don't work against them, they work for them. And the final piece is, when you're engaged with these rapidly changing exponential technologies, you can't do it alone when you're tackling big, tough, wicked challenges. Some things can be done solo, but these are systems and we engage those. And so the short context is, Will, when we're living in an age where it's short-term focused, we don't want the world to change, and we're regressing into ourselves solo. But the people who are succeeding in this kind of world have a very different approach, which is, what's the challenge much bigger than me, far larger than I am? It obviously has a long-term intent. It's going to engage these exponential technologies in a positive way. And I can't do it alone. It's going to require broader ecosystems to pull this off. Now, here's coming back to your question. Sorry, long intro. But when we operate longer term, when we engage in rapidly changing exponential technologies, when we are working with other people instead of solo, uncertainty, unknown, and the unexpected rise. That means we have to rethink.
Yeah, it seems common sense, though, right? That it's if you're riding a bike, you look ahead. If you're with a group, they will watch your back. It seems common sense. Why isn't this embraced as, why isn't this kindred quest, this ability to lean on each other, the way that business leadership exists?
One of the biases in that world of exponential technologies is called the exponential thinking bias, which is effectively, even if we're trained in math and science, Will, when we're given a simple calculation of, you invest 400 euros a year for the next 40 years and you get 5% interest per year compounding, what does that equal in 40 years? People underestimate by a magnitude of 10. Instead of 2.5 million, it's 250,000. Even smart people with math backgrounds have a short-term bias, and they don't think that's a long-term thinking process. And so the notion here is, we're not all like Warren Buffett, who when he was a teenager cut his own hair because he did the math on that amount he would be spending on a haircut and what it would pay off in 30 years. Most of us don't think that way.
Right.
But if we use that logic of finance in the world of life and think about this notion of compound, not just compound interest, but compound learning. I am doing something different today in order to make something bigger tomorrow. And why don't we do that? Because ranging from university education to the first professional role we have, to the first managerial role we have, 80% or more of people, and especially leaders, have a very short-term orientation. And the average C-suite leader reporting to the CEO, their tenure is less than 5 years, which means it's practically impossible to do anything long-term. Big impact projects take at least 6 years.
So how can you help leaders personally embrace more of what and depart from more to help them embrace the unexpected? What do they need to do less of and let go of to be able to? Do they just have to ignore this fear that their lives are on the line within 5-year period, or do they focus on different principles?
That notion, Will, of letting go and taking on, I love that framework. So take large language models as a simple example. I do this exercise called the question burst, where when I'm stuck on a problem, I literally, even if I'm alone, I set a timer for 4 minutes and try to generate 20 questions. And when I finish generating those 20 questions, 85% of the time, I've rethought the challenge. But then what I now do is input those questions into a large language model and say, what are the patterns here in these questions? What am I focusing on? And then it's, what are 10 or 20 more questions that I should have asked that I didn't? And then it's, out of all those questions, which ones seem most important to make progress on this challenge? And why is that so? Now, that's something I could not have done 3 years ago, but I can do it today. And so if I'm willing to take that risk of engaging with the technology in order to move my project forward faster, it's concrete, it's real, and it's impactful, and it's usually positive here and now. Now, what I have to do, though, in this age of AI is be very careful. When last year in 2023, when OpenAI brought out that large language model, ChatGPT, instead of generating those first 20 questions myself, I lazily asked the computer to give me those 20 questions. And I realized doing this 3 or 4 times, I am giving up my capacity to ask good questions. And so now I've made a very conscious choice. I'm going to do the hard mental work myself by generating those questions initially myself, then engage with the technology in order to collaboratively build something I couldn't before. So coming back to what do I do differently? Number one, don't run from these rapidly changing technologies that could rapidly change your world for the better, but at the same time, be incredibly vigilant about those technologies scraping off your human capacity in ways you don't want to happen.
It really is an exponential moment that, this new wave of solutions is not only disrupting, but it's also making us think harder, to your point, about the questions we ask. They say that wisdom is the questions we ask in life, not what we tell. So I was told by a brave man once. How should leaders rethink their assumptions, therefore, and approaches? And does it change when they're embracing a generative AI system, or is it just a rule of thumb that you've realized? Because you ask brilliant questions. I've seen when you've been leading some of these workshops and things, I'm like, damn, I never thought of that question. How do they rethink their assumptions and approaches to make sure they achieve what objective you're focusing on?
In a project I've been doing with Ed Catmull, one of the co-founders of Pixar, for the last 5 years, we've been studying and researching people like Jensen Huang at NVIDIA and so on.
Right.
And one of the things we've realized is that all of these people who are really good at navigating the absolutely unprecedented elements of uncertainty we're living in, they are equally exceptional at generating and sustaining truth-seeking mechanisms. Because when the world has a longer-term intent and the exponential technologies are rapidly changing and I'm engaging with others, uncertainty is going up, reality is not fixed. Even if we want to think it is, it's not. And when reality is not fixed and it's changing, the question becomes, well, what truth-seeking mechanism am I engaging to cut through the fluff, is what they would call it in the UK. It's like, don't fluff me. How do I cut through the fluff? What's my strategy? What's my mechanism? Now, that sounds pretty simple and straightforward, but honestly, relatively few people are conscious about that. So I just got back 2 days ago from Nairobi, Kenya, where we had our 15th grandchild, and we're a blended family. She had 3, I had 3, she had 4. Now I have 7 kids, and anyway, it's a big family.
Wow.
But when I was in Nairobi, I met with a friend there, professional friend and colleague. We were sitting having a conversation at a cafe, and he raised a challenge. And I said to him, well, here's a truth-seeking mechanism for me, that question burst method process I just described earlier. And given your challenge, would you like to do this with me? And he was aware of the truth-seeking mechanism, and he knew me well, Will. And he said to me, looking me in the eye, I think I'll try it later on my own.
Was that for fear? Or?
I think it was partly for fear that he knew, or he was confident that there would be some awkward questions surface during that conversation. And so I said, oh, so I stepped back and I'm like, you don't have to do this. It's an invitation. But if you do it with me, you might see things in a way that could surprise you. And what's really cool, Will, is about 5 minutes of going back and forth, he's like, let's try it.
Mm.
Now, what he was doing was he was being vulnerable with someone else about a real challenge that he's wrestling with. And if we move deeply inward in an age of uncertainty and don't move outward with truth-seeking mechanisms to get a different perspective on a reality that's always shape-shifting right now, we're operating not just in the dark, but in the dark with a world that is under our feet moving right and left.
Mm.
And the window of light that gives us some path to start walking through, not clarity, but at least a path, is I've got that kind of mechanism. You know, at Pixar, they use a brain trust mechanism for directors who are at the top of the creative heap, where they actually get people giving them feedback and questions nonstop for 3 hours about the challenges they're wrestling with. You know, there are other mechanisms, other places, but the question I often ask leaders, Will, is what's your truth-seeking mechanism?
Mm.
Is it working? Is it vibrant? Is it alive? Is it relevant? And a lot of leaders, they wrestle with that question.
I love that you're actually, I was interviewing a gentleman last week, and he was talking about an external influence, but also his internal influence was how do I do breath work and calm everything down?
Yeah.
And in my head the whole time I'm racing, going, why don't you just ask yourself the right question instead of having to distract into a zone that may not be the relevancy of how you're actually thinking when you have to perform as a leader? Do you change the parameters? It feels like you walk this tightrope between psychiatrist and mentor and guru. How are you balancing these elements of input when you should lean on the pedal more, or when you should just allow the natural process and flow of that leader to just find its way?
I'm going to go back to, in response, Will, that notion of if I worked with you, Will, and you were my supervisor,
yeah,
the question I'd be asking you is, when you show up either online or literally in some office with me, do I, Hal Gregersen, know with clarity what the most important challenge is that you care about?
Mm.
And the more political an organization is, the more opaque those challenges are. And so it's like, the first step is, I as a leader have to be clear about the challenges I care about. Right. And then the next part becomes, if the challenge is bigger than me, you have to know about what challenge do I care about, right?
Mm.
And for me to be willing, like my friend in Nairobi, Kenya, to reveal to you my challenge takes hard work. It takes time. It takes caring. It takes being there. But once you get to that moment where these are the collective set of challenges at a 360 sort of logic all around me that we care about, then my task as a leader is like, I am going to at least double the horizon of whatever my current challenge is. So if I'm thinking 1 year's out, go 2 years, 4, 3 years, 6, 4 years, 8. That's often the best people can do. It's like double that horizon, make the challenge bigger. And if you do that, don't play management consulting mumbo jumbo games with me, which is, the flavor of the day challenge because everybody else is doing it. No, you've got to own it, Will. I have to own it. And when I have this sense that you own that, the world just shifted like the tectonic plates moved in the organization, like an earth. It's just like, now I know.
Seismic.
Exactly, seismic.
Yeah.
And so for Ed Catmull, and the reason I was so intrigued by Ed 5 years ago when we've been working on this project is from 1970, in the 1970s, when he was the first one mathematically to figure out how do you model a 3D image on a screen, computer screen. He won the Turing Award for that in part recently because he's mathematically capable of figuring that out.
Wow.
But when he did, he also thought to himself, I've always been an artist. I've always wanted to make movies. And given what I just did, we could make a 90-minute full-length computer-generated animated film. That was his long-term intent. He thought it would take 10 years. He worked for George Lucas at Lucasfilm on Star Wars 2 and 3 when those first came out. And all the time he was making software, hardware, and storytelling advances on his bigger long-term dream as they were doing short-term things where movies had to come out in 3 years. It took 23 years from start to finish for Ed to make that movie. But he was resolute about the intent and committed every step of the way to create value for whoever he was working with in that process. And so for me, Will, it's just like, I'd done this work with Clayton Christensen and Jeff Dyer around the innovator's DNA, and we discovered these skills of, interviewing people like Pierre Omidyar, founder of eBay, and so on. And basically, they ask provocative questions that challenge the status quo. They observe the world like anthropologists. They network and talk to people who are different from them in perspective and worldview. They rapidly experiment and prototype, and they take the time to make the connections, connect the dots that other people don't. Now, those 5 skills we know from a 25,000 data point set actually help anybody, famous or infamous, or not. Yeah. It's like they help anybody make better progress on their challenges. But here's what I realized in this exponential age, as Azeem Azhar has put it in his recent book, it's just like in this exponential age, it's those 5 skills, or my book, Questions Are the Answer, around creating conditions where you're wrong, uncomfortable, and reflectively quiet. They're necessary, all of that, but I realize they're not sufficient in this time, 2024. Something else is going on. And that's when I realized it's this other stuff. These people have paid a price to understand the value and power of long-term intent. And they know over the course of their 30 years that nothing significant happened without at least a 6-year time horizon.
Right. Yeah. And it seems that, it's like your friend when you were in Nairobi and you were saying, it took 5 minutes to create him to see that this conversation would be a benefit. It seems that you have to be in an environment where this line of depth of thinking is permitted. And many leaders today, as you said earlier, don't feel that. How can you sculpt that environment so that you feel you're safe and that you have the room to answer the right question at the right pace to be able to deliver the long game?
Wow. So many things come to mind. First of all, there's the notion of, number one, I've got to not only hold but embrace the tensions of short-term, long-term, rapidly changing, slow-changing technologies, solo system work. Those are tensions. And, it's the spirit of and, not or. It's like, I get it. And so for these leaders that Ed and I have been studying, they don't think either or when it comes to long-term, short-term. It's just not their way of, it's like both. That's the first part. The second part is, what are my truth-seeking mechanisms? And underneath that, it's how do I see and think deeply, which is what you're asking, Will.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, we get so caught up in the thick of thin things, for most of us, that we don't think deeply. And that it requires, I'm thinking out loud here with you, okay?
Yeah, it's great.
Which is, it requires, number one, getting outside of ourselves. Deep thinking that's self-centered does not go very deep. Deep thinking that's other-centered for lack of a better word, invites the cosmos to collaborate. It's like, I'm thinking deeply about an issue that's really important to the future of this organization or my community or my family. Now, to think deeply, it is imperative that I see deeply and listen deeply, not just hear, not just notice, but I see deeply. And that for me is where photography has always been a personal mechanism to sharpen, inspire, restore my ability to see things I otherwise wouldn't see. And so when I grab that camera, I am purposefully engaging with the world in ways I normally wouldn't.
Is it because it slows you down to be able to realize that you have to capture the right image versus flow through it? What's the trigger difference to you?
The deepest form of seeing is a moment when the making of a photo reveals something new about the object in the photo and the person making it, myself. And so we live on a little island, semi-island north of Boston called Nahant. And one night in the wintertime, I was driving home recently, it was a few months ago, freezing cold, and there was a work crew in the middle of the night trying to fix a broken water main. And they were like going to the New York City Ballet. They were coordinated. They were like a special forces crew. I could just see it. And so I stopped for 2 hours making photographs of them. Wow. And the photographs are, some of them just are jaw-dropping for me. As I walked in, and I actually went home and printed a half dozen photos and took them back to them because I wanted them to have it as a sort of, this is theirs. And then that moment created that seeing deeply that I never would have imagined, which is one of the workers had the time to stop and we were talking, and he asked about me and I asked about him. And I mentioned that my father was a pile driver, which are these big, massive machines that drive those steel beams in the bottom of skyscrapers to make the foundation for them to not fall over.
Right.
And he looked at me and he said, wow, they are amazing at what they do and so skilled. And well, long story short, my father and I had a troubled relationship growing up. And I've had to wrestle with some of those troubles. He was a good human being in so many different ways, but we had troubles in other ways. And that moment when we were having the conversation and this stranger was telling me about how cool these people were, it's like my heart was finally ready to open to accept my father in wholeness for who he really was and appreciate him, good and bad. And it was a tender, powerful moment where I saw something inside of myself that was a function of caring enough about 7 people fixing a water main to freeze my butt off in the cold for 3 hours. They knew I was committed to them, and it led us to an insight that otherwise would not have happened.
And I love that you saw it through fresh eyes of somebody who was also, working in industry like your father, where your father's job was to go deep. Your father's job was to take things deep to ensure the stability of the long game, the construction on top of it. Amazing.
Well, it is amazing. And that's where, very recently, a close friend of mine passed away, David Brashears. He was the cinematographer director for the 1996 IMAX film about Everest when that disaster happened and a dozen or so folks passed away. Yeah. David passed away suddenly in his late 60s. He lives nearby here. And huge loss. But I'm going to go back 9 years when David and I were in the Khumbu ice fall together. I was very sick with some mild altitude sickness and some infection. David had made a commitment before I left to my wife that he would bring me home alive.
Wow.
And when my ego was telling me to go higher into the icefall, David and Fulla Sherpa had been watching me carefully. And David resolutely looked me in the eye and he said, "No, we're going back." David had the long term in mind.
Yeah.
And even if it pissed me off in the short term, he was not going to let go of the long term. And that's one of the things I loved about David Bashir's. And that's that notion of you don't play games with people at work or home about these long-term intents that will require sacrifice to get there. We can't play games with people around these things because we're inviting them to give up something for us all to get there.
Yeah, we sometimes forget that we're actually all tied together, and especially in mountaineering, right? You need something like that the weakest link or the strength of the team is what gets everybody there, and that's what gives you that elevated perspective.
Well, and in an exponential age where technologies are combining and compounding, with, by definition, because they're exponential technologies, that word exponential by definition means the future is unpredictable and the consequences are unknown. And this cuts right to the core of most managerial assumptions, which is they like to be in control. But in this world we're living in, with that word exponential, there's, again, the cute, speaker, management consult speak of using that word. But when you look at it as a hard, concrete word and concept, what it means is things are going to be unexpected and unpredictable, positive and negative. Are you ready for that kind of world? And those consequences could be so significant that it will impact all of us, in the spirit of what you were saying, Will. All of us.
Yeah.
Which means none of us are bit players in this play we're in right now. We're all central players. And I mentioned earlier, we have 15 grandchildren. I have an obligation to those 15 kids. And I think we all do to that next generation, which means this is not a conversation today just about how can I survive between 2024 and 2025 in my business. Because the way in which we approach that challenge, if we don't rethink it and approach it differently, may actually, at a collective level, create consequences that are irreversible for the rest of us.
Absolutely. And it's good, the timing for this conference, the theme of this year's Innovation Realize Summit is Rethink. What key message do you want to ensure that you leave behind at this event to make sure that leaders feel they can be empowered to ask the questions that need to be asked?
David Bashir's once told me, when they're stuck in a really dangerous, uncertain situation, stop, breathe, think, act. And once we've done that, then it becomes this I want this to be on, Will, and I'm thinking, what is the message? It'd probably be the following. Five years ago, I took an incredibly deep dive into this thing we call exponential, and what does that mean? I'll admit being a novice in that space. 3 years later, I'd felt like I'd drunk out of 7 different fire hoses at once and realized that even though I've studied innovation and inquiry for most of my life in a variety of different settings, what I knew was insufficient for where we are. And I'm reminded of Mary Parker Follett in the late 1800s and early 1900s during the industrial age. She was a management consultant during that period of time. And she just often said, we don't have the words. We don't have the words to describe what we're talking about. And the words I'm now going to use are my best attempts at, well, what else might I do in order to navigate through this world? Of course, I've got to stay curious and ask questions. Of course, I've got to learn how to hold tensions that are going to be inevitable. Of course, I've got to figure out and understand, exponential technologies and things that aren't changing. Of course, I've got to do all of that. But underneath all of that, I've got to have this enhanced, deepened, refined, sharpened capacity to seek the truth, to understand what's really going on here. And that is going to require seeing things I've never seen before, searching for things I've never searched before, and being very surprised, often uncomfortable with what happens. A good friend of mine, Matt Dwyer, runs innovation materials at Patagonia, and he calls his team members truth seekers. And he expects them to leave no stone unturned. For example, if you're trying to find the purity and clarity of a supply chain, no stone unturned, team. We've got to get to the truth of the situation. The instant we become managers, people start telling us what they think we want to hear and stop telling us what they think we don't want to hear. And the higher we go in organizations, the worse that gets. Right. And in the age we're living in, all of that is compounded. And so I suppose my most important message from Innovation Realized is you've got to rethink your truth-seeking mechanisms in a world where truth is changing really fast about you, about your team, about your organization, about our communities, our nations, our societies, and this world we live in. And if you have not considered what those truth-seeking, reality-seeking mechanisms are, do it today. Don't delay. The world is moving too fast for us to be operating on assumptions that reflect conclusions from the past. And that's the notion of not rethinking, not challenging the assumptions. And again, all of that, Will, all of that is something that we've been told before. We've been around long enough to know that rethink your assumptions, challenge your assumptions. All I can say is rethink and challenge them with these truth-seeking mechanisms in a way that we get hit over the head so hard we can't not rethink. Seek out that sort of a context. I suppose that's what we're in. Because if we don't seek it out, it's going to seek us.
Spectacular. Hal Gregersen, always bringing a fresh light to what really, truly matters to us all. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening, this morning, wherever people are in the world. And I can't wait to join you back again at EY Innovation Realized this April and dig deep and help others elevate what truly matters in their world.
And Will, a reciprocal thank you back for being a very good listener, for asking good questions, and for continuing a conversation about how do we navigate this incredibly beautiful, fascinating, and challenging world. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's an honor.